Okay. So the perspective that I'll try to reflect back in terms of these topics is from my perspective as a developer of systems, cell culture tools myself over the extent of my career, but also as someone who's tried to utilize and adopt these various three-dimensional and dynamic flow systems as part of our work at the Hamner. Now, a number of good points have already been brought up, and I'll try not to beat them to death too much. So what I'll try to do is put it in perspective of our own ability to use these systems and attempt specifically to do chemical testing at the Hamner. Because I think to put it in the context of where we all started, and I think where Dr. Chu earlier in his presentation is like from a risk assessor's point of view, what do you need on your end to do a better job is partly what I interpret this. And if you're going to pass that on to Tony, who's maybe making these more sophisticated biological systems, what does he need to bear in mind, and what kind of data sets do they need to be creating? That's kind of the perspective where we have at the Hamner, I would argue, trying to tie that together. Because I think we heard some amazing advances today on the biological side of things, especially compared to where we were 10 years ago, I would argue, and certainly when I started my career many years before that. So we're getting closer from a biological sense of recapitulating the types of events, the types of phenotypes, on an organ, tissue, or cellular level. But one of the things I think where we still need to bridge the gaps is when we begin to take more of a holistic or system-wide or systems biology approach of tying them together. And that's where I think there's still some disjointedness or disconnections. And because if you put it in perspective of human physiology and just natural compartmentalization of our organs, if you will, as well as the blood flow to those different compartments. And knowing is from a toxicity point of view or a toxicologist point of view, in a way, dose or exposure is the poison. How are we going to put all that in perspective, especially as we're tying these compartments together? Now, to us, we're also interested in not only each of these compounds or chemical sets as the compound or parents themselves, but also major metabolites or key metabolites that are being generated in vivo that could very well be going downstream and impacting these other organs. And we all know examples or have examples of those in each of our systems. So beginning to, I guess, make it more natural or realistic as we're tying these more sophisticated systems together in a holistic fashion or a systems approach. And I think I'd like to see more effort or communication between the different groups as to how to do that from a pharmacokineticist point of view or a physiologist point of view. Like, how do you account for the size of the liver, for example, and its ability to clear compounds, to metabolize compounds, but then also produce those subsequent metabolites in a meaningful way for any organs that you might then be exposing downstream in your more sophisticated three-dimensional system. So I would encourage more communication along those lines. Some of our own experiences with adopting and utilizing these systems have already been brought up, but I guess I will emphasize or second again is the issues with translating these from generally the labs where they're generated. It's become sort of a technology transfer issue and what they can get to work very well in their house or in their labs to a lab was just trying to do routine testing of chemicals. It's not necessarily invested in the technology. They haven't got trained technicians that have lived and breathed with these systems every day, especially in students, graduate students, postdocs, et cetera. So they just want the systems to work for their purposes. And I think doing better jobs with technology transfer, protocol, and training, there's an educational component to adopting and utilizing these systems. And in fact, I'd be curious to hear from people, including Francisca, who mentioned that they're starting to maybe adopt some of these systems, how long it actually took for someone in their labs to adopt and utilize these for maybe testing a handful of compounds, let alone hundreds or thousands of compounds. So bearing those kind of practical issues in mind. Certainly we've encountered issues related to the materials sciences, again, that were brought up before, but I'll reiterate is unfortunately a lot of test compounds or test sets that people are using have been drugs that they've shown, but that doesn't represent at all the usual chemical space that we have to deal with with environmentals and how sticky those are. And in fact, I almost guarantee you the biggest issue will be non-specific binding, especially to plastics and other materials, rubbers and things like that. So we need help from the engineers there, not only in bridging these systems compartmentally, but also in manners where we don't have to worry about non-specific binding and other issues like that. And then I think I would also like to continue the discussion about how to translate any data that's generated from these systems. It's like, what are going to be relevant endpoints? What's possible that then we can either derive points of departure or AC50 values that can be plug and played easily into, let's say, computer algorithms, or begin to put things in perspective or comparing apples to apples. And along those lines, one of the issues that we've been challenged with and also struggled with is when you go into these more three-dimensional or sophisticated systems, and most of your historical data has been generated in like a two-dimensional static culture like HepG2 model. Most of my experience is with the liver, so I can relate to that aspect of it. How are you going to standardize or benchmark or compare data now in these more three-dimensional systems? You know, by what criteria, what endpoint, let alone standardizing the conditions and controlling those so one lab who's generating this data set can compare their results with another, for example. But at the end, we all are funneling that through the same path or to the risk assessors. So again, I can go on and on as well, but I think that's about 8 minutes at least of time, so I'll pass the baton there.